All right. I'll get my slideshow to start working here. There we go. Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Eleanor Rangers, and I'm the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society. We've been around actually almost July will mark the beginning of our 16th year in operation, starting out collecting oral histories of people involved in Cold War related activities in the southeastern Pennsylvania area, but we've kind of expanded our remit to include educational programming like the one that you're listening in on this evening. I know I've mentioned several times that we are hopefully going to be planning an event in July of 2026, probably with some other local museums and historical societies in the Bucks County area. I'm almost ready to be able to kind of give that announcement, but it will be something involving aerospace, and I'm pretty excited to talk a little bit more about it maybe next month. So stay tuned. We are definitely planning something. And this is our History in Our Backyard webinar series, which we have throughout the course of the year, along intermittently with some live lectures that we actually do in Warminster, Pennsylvania, at the site of the old Johnsville Centrifuge. I do want to mention, as a nonprofit organization, I have to make the little plea that if you so choose to donate to a nonprofit, please consider us when you are doing that. And I do appreciate support that many people that have listened in on these lectures have given to us in the past. So thank you for that. There is on our website, coldwarhistory.org, a donate button where you can very easily submit a donation electronically. We do record these programs. As you heard, the recordings start at the beginning of this, and I do archive those on our YouTube channel, which is under the name of our organization. So definitely, if you want to listen to something on demand after the fact, definitely check it out there. Or if you can't find it, just shoot me an email and I can send you the link. That's not a problem. We do also try to add other Cold War related content periodically to the website, or to the YouTube channel, so it is worth checking it out fairly regularly. We also maintain a Facebook page for those of you who are on that social media platform. Feel free to check that out. I do try to keep that updated, basically mostly with our program announcements and occasionally some other space race and Cold War related news articles. We do have a fledgling presence as well now on another social media platform known as MeWe. And actually, most of the Naval Air Development Center page that was maintained by Doug Crompton, for those of you who may know him, has migrated over there. And I do try to post on that page as well. So if you are on that platform, definitely check it out as well. We are in mid-year now with our lecture series for 2025, and we'll introduce our guest speaker for this evening in a moment. Next month, I do want to mention that we have Stephen Walker returning. He's actually spoken for us a couple times. Gentleman from the UK who has spoken about Yuri Gagarin, and then last year about Hiroshima. This year, he's going to be talking about Germain Titov, the second cosmonaut to have flown in space, who was quite a character. And I'm really looking forward to another wonderful presentation by Stephen next month. And then we're back in the centrifuge in Warminster in August for Chris Sturdivant and Gary Powers Jr., who have both spoken for us before. They're going to be talking about their new book, Cold War Virginia. So definitely looking forward to that. And then we'll be in the back end of the year with some additional lectures, mostly webinars that will be coming up. Here's just the plug for Stephen Walker's presentation in July. So very much looking forward to that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, who has been with us many times. I am delighted to say, is David Stumpf. And David is a retired plant biochemist living in Tucson, Arizona, and he has written multiple nuclear weapon histories: Regulus the Forgotten Weapon, a history of the Navy's Regulus 1 and 2 cruise missiles; Titan II, a history of a Cold War missile system; Minuteman, a technical history of the missile, and the last 30 seconds, a brief history of the evolution of hit-to-kill technology, which was actually his last lecture that he gave for us. And David also volunteered at the Titan Missile Museum in Arizona as a historian and tour guide for many years. And he was also instrumental in the effort to gain a National Historic Monument status for that museum. And I am very excited to also announce that David was awarded the 2024 Old School Writing Technical Writing Award by the Air Force Historical Foundation that he just told me about when he signed in to the Zoom this evening. So congratulations, David. That's quite an accomplishment. And from what you mentioned, it sounds like folks in the Pentagon are actually using your your books as reference material on their own nuclear arsenal, which I find really interesting. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to David. I'm going to get out of my presentation and let him share his slides, and we will go from there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eleanor. I'm glad to be here again. I look forward to giving these lectures. This one's going to be on the evolution of the Peacekeeper canister launch system. For some reason, I get focused on arcane subjects like this, and I find that little has been written about the detail for the canister launch system, which makes it all the more interesting for me to write about. I will warn two things. One, I sometimes get into the nitty-gritty a little more than I need to. And two, I have Parkinson's, so sometimes triggering the next slide becomes a bit of an issue, so please bear with me. Okay, so evolution of the launch system. In the beginning. On October 16, 1962, about the time things were starting to warm up in Cuba, the Air Force briefed 250 representatives of 88 aerospace companies. I had no idea that many aerospace companies in 1962 on its requirements for the next generation solid propellant advanced ICBM. There were 3 studies involving 10 exploratory tasks that were described. A common denominator to all basing modes was the concept of a containerized missile. This was the distant beginning of Peacekeeper. Of course, it wasn't known by that name back then. It was Weapon System 120A. So innovative thinking was involved. Basing mode options for the AICBM included many. The ones that surprised me were submerged encapsulated missiles in a dormant state in lakes or in the ocean off the coast that could be launched once they were brought to the surface. Amazing idea. The Navy already had that taken care of with Polaris, but the Air Force, I guess, wanted to get into that. The other was mobile missiles transported and launched from a commercial 18-wheel tractor trailer. To accomplish these goals would require a solid propellant missile that could be transported, emplaced, and launched from a canister. But first things first. By 1965, the cold launch technique had been perfected by the Navy's Polaris program. The Polaris A3 was being routinely launched using a cold launch system. But the question was, could a system that would launch a Polaris A3, which was roughly 33 feet high, 4.5 feet in diameter, and weighed a mere 35,000 pounds, could that be transferred into an ICBM class missile that was 70 feet, 10 feet in diameter, and weighed 194,000 pounds? This is a good question. So the Air Force asked it, and 2 companies came to the forefront to work on the issue. They were awarded contracts. Westinghouse built the launcher canister for the Navy. So they got the large cold launched missile program, and the Lockheed Propulsion Company got the self-eject program. So we're going to discuss a little bit about both of those now. The launches took place at the test facilities, Minuteman Test Silo 01 and 02 at Edwards Air Force Base. They built a multi-purpose silo, two of them, and they put in these what do you want to call them, liners at different diameters as they played with test missiles for Minuteman to see which would be the most effective, both for the launch and for cost issues. Apparently, those are still there. So the large cold launch missile program, 16 June 1965, the successful cold launch of an AICBM class airframe. There were two Minuteman test silos, 26 feet in diameter and 12, 14, and 16 feet. I'm sorry, the annulus was 12, 14, or 16 feet in diameter. The water, and you can see the exhaust is coming from the engines that were motors that were used to propel it out of the silo. And then those black dots are guide shoes. It was tethered. The reason it's turning over, it was only supposed to go a few hundred feet in the air, and it was tethered so it didn't land on the facility, so they could keep using it. Now, it's an interesting story. This is obviously, to me, an official Air Force photograph. The only people that have a copy of this photograph are not the Air Force, it's Aviation Week, and I had to spend a pretty penny to get the rights to publish it. I find that personally kind of annoying that if it's an official government photograph, why should I have to pay a nickel for it? But anyway, it's a classic one-of-a-kind photograph, so it was worth the money spent.
Don't feel bad. Getty Images does that all the time, that they'll slap their watermark on like an official NASA image. I'm like, I thought all NASA stuff was public domain, but then once
Yeah.
Getty gets a hold of it, that's different.
Well, and then think about the stuff that NASA has that's classified. Huh? But anyway. Okay, so self-eject, 28 October 1965, same test site, successful launch of by Lockheed Propulsion Company of an ICBM class airframe. What they did was, you can see, let me see if I can get my cursor up here. Yeah, you can see down here these seals. All they did was they put a seal in so the exhaust from the ignition of the first stage would basically pop it up out of the canister. What they found was a specific end grain for the first stage they could put in that was slow burning, that would generate the gas they needed, and it would pop up. But the Air Force didn't go with it. They went with cold launch instead. And I think that had to do with not wanting to mess around with the solid propellant in terms of adding some special initial propellant for the self-eject phenomenon. Okay, let me get my cursor back down here. So now that we had a cold launch methodology, what basing mode would we use? On 2 February 1966, the Air Force began preliminary work on the WS-120A. No name yet. The ARPA contracted with the Institute for Defense Analysis to evaluate alternate basing concepts for the WS-120A. Now, when I contacted the Institute for Defense Analysis, they were very arrogant with me and would not provide me with any of the unclassified materials. They said there's no need for me to know. And I asked if it was secret, and they said no, but we're not going to give it to you anyway. So go figure. The result was known as Strat X, which is still highly classified. I have some unclassified portions of it. We'd love to get the fully declassified, but it's not going to happen in my lifetime. So they went through 125 basing concepts and recommended 8 for further study. Two concepts involve land-based ICBMs, hard rock silo and land mobile. I wrote an article about vulnerability for the Air Force Historical Foundation Journal that discusses hard rock silo in great detail. A new threat developed at about this time. In the fall of '63, the Soviets began flight testing their Soviet R-36, which is a NATO designation of SS-9, the Scarp. Deployment started in '66. It was similar to Titan II, using both hypergolic propellants and an inertial guidance system. The improved accuracy represented a direct threat to the Titan II launch facilities and Minuteman, not only the silos, but they could take out one of the launch control centers without having to waste the time on these adjacent silos, or excuse me, launch facilities. The Titan II and Minuteman launch facilities and launch control centers had been built to withstand an airburst because at that time that was as accurate as the Soviet weapons were. It took only 6 inches of soil on top of the Titan II silo closure door to prevent opening. So it seems to me instead of worrying about digging these things out of the ground, you just had to land a nuclear warhead close enough to toss the soil up and cover the silo. Similar Minuteman details remain classified. The difference also with Minuteman is it's not the launcher closure door is not jacked up and moved like in the Titan II. The silo closure door from Minuteman is pulled back by a cable. It comes up a detente and rolls out on tracks. So it would be a little hard to determine what amount of weight would be deleterious to its opening. So there were further considerations. One of them, of course, was Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. On 4 October '67, he denied an Air Force request to start development of the WS-120A. He directed the Air Force to look at the development of hard rock silos for Minuteman III, which the Air Force started to do. Then on 19 November 1971, Headquarters Strategic Air Command issued a required operational capability for the advanced ICBM. And the reason they did that was Nixon was now president and looked favorably on the concept. So in 1972, the ICBM was designated as Missile X, or MX. So early canister systems. Boeing, when I was researching the Minuteman book, I came across a vast amount of information on something called the Super Hard Cold Launch Missile Program, most of which they wouldn't let me have. I could look at it, but they wouldn't let me have it. I did find one set of records, though. And on 12 November 1967, they released a 9-month in-house study of launch tubes, launcher closure operating systems, and methods of penetrating or removing debris. I'm not going to bore everybody with a myriad of examples, some of which were quite, well, innovative. So, super hard cold launch missile. The first one is, let me get my cursor up here. You can see the missile suspended here. And what they do is take this and force it up through the dirt to form this larger annulus. And then they're going to launch the missile through what is going to end up being 100 or more feet of interior space, which turned out to be not such a hot idea. So the next idea was to take the entire silo, not just the canister, and push it up through the soil and launch. And then they narrowed that down to a much smaller, easier system. And this is the one that most closely is recognizable as what was developed for MX. So vertical shelter arrangements That was the name given to the first MX studies done by Boeing. And they dug in out in the desert at the National Test Site. They dug this very complete and elaborate, three of them actually, 15-foot diameter silos, and lined them and put all the operating gear in. And a truly amazing amount of money was spent. So there's an access ladder down into a access utility vault. Then there's a personnel barrier on the top. They didn't have a silo closure door per se. They had one in place, but it didn't slide. Then there's the closure door, the capsule assembly. They didn't call it a canister at the time. Egress guides to help keep it centered. The actuator bearing area. A capsule support pedestal. Now, as a plant biochemist, I have no idea how you engineer this kind of thing. It flabbergasts me. So this is the example of the capsule. Support equipment bay assembly, that housed the actuator that was going to push 350,000 pounds worth of missile and material and dirt up out of the soil and launch. Then there's the egress actuator, the bulkhead assembly, lower missile bay, basically simulating the missile. Mass simulators, center bay, more mass simulator. You can see the little guy standing there, upper assembly. And this is the part that I found most interesting. This was called the tip-off. And all the operating equipment was right here. So the missile was self-contained in that its operating equipment was with it on top of it. And as we'll see in a minute, there was an interesting way of clearing all that out. So vertical launch sequence. So here it is sitting on alert. It pops up, pushes its way through the soil. Then that top part, the operating support equipment, is tipped over and falls off, and the missile could be launched. They didn't launch any with these tests, but they showed that it was possible. So on 23 August 1979, I happened to stumble across, well, not on that day, I stumbled across these pictures. Now, if you look carefully, this thing's a 15-foot diameter cylinder that they popped up. And if you look right there, those are guys in white hard hats. Now, I'm not sure I'd be standing underneath something that thick with loose soil on top, but then again, I'm not an engineer. So there's what happens with the egress. They tilt it, they dump the soil off, they dump the operating ground equipment, so support equipment, and the missile's ready to launch. So they did this again later, much later, through much deeper soil. And I thought this would be kind of fun to see. This is a small ICBM. You notice how much thinner, narrower the cylinder is. Same silo closure. But look at that. That's 15 feet of soil. Tilt it over. It goes crashing to the ground. They're ready to launch. So this indicated that the idea was sound, but was that really what they wanted to do? So in the meantime, they went ahead and started developing the actual canister. So here we have the canister assembly launch test program. On the left is the assembly building. They assembled the missile, MX here, then used cranes to put it into the canister and did the cold launch. The first launch was successful. It's 29 January 1982, National Test Site. The same mass and center of gravity for the operational missiles were put into these surrogates. let's Eleanor, let's go ahead and run the film. So do I
Okay.
need to stop sharing?
Yeah, if you can stop sharing, then I'll reshare with the with the
Okay.
video.
I have a film that just shows in very briefly the egress. I think it's interesting.
Okay.
So it was designed to do just that, to clear the canister and then get tethered and pulled back into a safe place so it didn't damage the building. Let me see where my cursor went. There it is.
Yeah, and you can reshare.
Okay. So this is the building they did all the work in. All of the launches were use a black graphite epoxy canister. I did further research, and it turns out even though this is half the weight of the metal steel canisters, there had been, I don't know if anybody remembers the time that a Pershing 2 lit off in Germany due to a static electricity discharge. And they were worried that the graphite epoxy canisters might develop similar problems. So they went to all steel. So after about 6 launches this way, they needed to check one more thing, and that was called the Minuteman upper silo simulation test. What they did, as you can see in the inset, they have what looks like a Minuteman launch opening, and below is the uh, level 1 room, equipment room. What they needed to do was test the effect of the launch. They needed to detect two things. One thing with both this and the earlier program, was did all the protective padding on the missile to keep it from knocking into the canister, did that all come off on a routine basis? And what was the effect of flying through the open uh, LER launcher equipment first floor? Because they didn't worry about this for the missiles in the field because they were single launch missiles. But at Vandenberg, they were going to be reusing the launch facilities, so they needed to know how to protect from the steam. It wasn't from the rocket exhaust; it was from the steam and that environment that they needed to protect the equipment from. You can see the missile down there below. The tether was they didn't want to waste the money on telemetry, so it all came out the tether direct wire to the equipment. So here's the canister, and I'm just going to quickly go through some of the external detail. The canister weighed approximately 25,000 pounds. Now, you cannot find that information in any of the TOs, but the American Institute of Astronautics and Aeronautics published a paper on the graphite epoxy, the benefits of using graphite epoxy as their canister. And in there, they make the calculation for a type of stainless steel. So I used my calculations for the surface area and volume of metal, and my calculations came out right on with theirs. So I'm pretty sure I can say the canister weighed 25,000 pounds. So the elevator, the launch that they did way back when was in 65, also demonstrated something called the air elevator. This was an innovative system that allowed them to lower or raise the missile stages when they put the missile in place, very easily doing so without the need for a large crane. So that's level stop number one. Then the missile guidance system access door, umbilical opening for the umbilical is going to be a flyaway umbilical, canister tube structure, as shock isolation, pad mounting locations. This is the exterior of the canister. Elevator stop position level 2. Cable guide ring. We'll be showing more information on that shortly. Elevator stop positions 3, 4, 5. And then the longitudinal restraint mechanism. So what ended up happening after all this money was spent on different ways to deploy the missile, and all the people in Nevada and Colorado and Arizona didn't want it, they came up with Peacekeeper and Minuteman silos. Now, it's interesting you say Minuteman silos because Minutemen staff and engineers and crew regard silos as something you store corn in. They're Minuteman launch facilities. So the existing closure system was used. The debris collar was new. Operating the support equipment on existing shock isolated floor. Shock isolation vertical reaction ring, I'll show you in a minute. Launcher equipment room level 1 was still in use, but they took away the top 6 feet of the upper launch tube, removed. That way they could access the RV and all of that. Vertical shock isolation system suspension cable, which we'll discuss in a minute. The canister, obviously. Elastomeric block isolators, 5 rows at 6 blocks each. The launch seal, launch eject gas generator, and the liquid spring vertical shock isolators, which in itself was quite interesting. I found patents, but they didn't really describe the shock isolators in the detail I wanted. Then the air elevator. So this is a vertical canister, not the missile, the canister vertical shock isolation system. There's a missile support ring, which had the locations for the upward end of the support cables. So the canister suspension cable went through guides down to the lower guide pair and then connected to the actuator, which I'll show you in just a minute in greater detail. The lower support structure housed all this equipment. The lower support structure foot, when they got ready to launch, they lowered the entire canister down to where it was supported by this foot for a stable launch platform. And that's the lever arm with the liquid spring devices. This is a little bit better view. The Peacekeeper had only a 16.5-inch annulus. They didn't need that for exhaust. That was just, they left that so that very skinny airmen could go down in their work cage and do what little repair they could do. But there's the hydraulic charge line, nitrogen control lines, ordnance input cable, ordnance J box, launch tube wall, 16.5-inch space, liquid spring, lever arm, lower support foot like I showed you before, and the bleed down valve, which we'll be discussing in just a few minutes. Tubing clamps, obviously, and then the suspension cables, 3 pairs of cables. This is just a side view of a shock isolator, and I'll get to why that's intrigued me in just a minute. This is a picture of the lower support assembly with the shock isolation springs. Let me get up here. So here are the liquid springs. Here are the actuators. This is a manhole access to the bottom of the canister. I think that would have been very interesting to get up into. Now you may notice these guys right here. This is actually horizontal. I raised it vertical because it looked, I could explain it and understand it better. So why did I bring all this up in this detail? This is what the Minuteman III shock isolation system looks like. Quite a bit more complicated, and it's hard to describe how it works, but much more complicated. And this is a drawing of it, again showing how much more complicated it is than the Peacekeeper system. Peacekeeper system was remarkably efficient. Liquid springs were a great concept. So this is at the top, underneath the debris collar, which we'll be discussing in a minute. This is the missile support ring. And you can see its construction here. I'm just, like I said, I'm not an engineer, so I just find it hard to believe 200,000 pounds worth of missile and canister can be supported on 3 pairs of cables like this. But I always maintained it was a good thing I wasn't an engineer. And the reason I didn't want to become an engineer was I didn't want to drive over a bridge that I designed, since calculus and I were not the best of friends. Where's my clicker going? There we are. So down there you can see another pair of cable guides. These are the elastomeric blocks that kept the canister from rattling in the space of the launch duct. That was a propellant, a Freon line for the coolant. And that's the actual canister surface. So there was a debris collar that kept, when the silo closure door opened, the launcher closure door opened, the debris would land ostensibly on the RV, which the reentry vehicle shroud, which could handle it. It was made out of titanium. And then they had these debris collars, which I'll show you in a minute. I keep saying that, but I really will. So the reentry shroud, the actual canister, and the debris collar, and the wire rope assembly, which, well, on first motion, the tension was such that the wire rope assembly would break and the debris collar foam segments would pop up and lay back off the missile. Launch seal, we don't have not much good information on, But obviously, with the air elevator, something had to seal the missile away from blowing all the air by it. Missile aft skirt extension, longitudinal support assembly. So the missile was also supported on a longitudinal support assembly, not only the canister. And delayed release assembly. So come over here to the integrated air elevator. On the left is the whole thing stacked together. And then on the right are the pieces. So the air elevator is here. Inside the air elevator is placed the launch eject gas generator, which generated hot gas, which had some water, made the steam, and blew the missile out of the canister. Then the longitudinal support was on top of all of that. Now, interestingly enough, I read on a website, and I think this guy knows better. He said the entire canister was launched by the air elevator. It wasn't. It stayed in the hole. What was launched was the missile. So the debris collar I've been yammering about, these are the 12 segments, and they folded up and in and protected the missile. So the silo closure door is open. These are in place. Any dirt that comes off the top of the door would fly down, not go down into the canister and possibly cause problems between the missile and the canister. The debris collar foam segments would stop that from happening. So here's the air elevator in cross section. The red shows the actual air elevator sealed, I'm sorry, where the compressed air is going. And then the launch, the seals are in green. This is the launch eject gas generator. What happened was through an initiator, a solid propellant charge was ignited. The hot gases came down into a water reservoir, generated the steam, and caused the expansion of the steam and the resulting ejection of the missile. So if you put all this together on a side view, you would see this. So if you wanted to remove the missile, the red, whole red up part would, in those previous slides, would slide up the canister and allow you to pick the RV off and then the fourth, third, second, and first stages. A pretty remarkable, in my opinion, a pretty remarkable design. This is a canister that's being ready to ship. Each of these blocks on the side here are the elastomeric, the elastomeric blocks. When in place, they had a polyethylene sheet between them and the launch duct surface, which reduced the friction when you were lowering the canister into place. Lateral support group within the canister, you had to protect the missile from rattling to the side of the canister and getting damaged. So they had the longitudinal support assembly, which took care of the vertical motion, the launch seal, obviously, and the lateral support group were these rows of pads that protected the missile from contact with the launch duct. So here's 17 June 1983, flight test missile, Roman numeral 1, is on the test pad on launch, test pad 01 at Vandenberg. Now, why did they do this? Well, the problem was they were behind in getting the what was the name of oh, I don't remember. I think it was 08, a launch facility, Minuteman converted to Peacekeeper. So instead of being delayed, they set up a canister and launched from the canister. So this missile went ahead and flew to Kwajalein very successfully. Now, what I'm showing in this insert here are the pads inside had spring actuators with a delay. So once it cleared the silo, the canister, the delay set off and springs pushed the pads away. So the missile is actually flying through this first ring of pads. You can see the smoke as the charge is going off. The first row of pads has already been released, and the charges are going off to allow the lower pads. I don't know, it may not have been charges. That may be steam. I believe it's steam. So if you're going to, now again, I'm a plant biochemist, I'm not an engineer. If you're going to lower one of these canisters into the silo, you need an installation bracket. So this monstrous thing allowed the crane operator to get the canister centered and appropriately so it didn't damage it when it was lowering it into the launch duct, launch tube. Then I'm always impressed with cranes. And here's this crane picking up a 70-foot, 25,000-pound device, putting it into that bracket and lowering it down somewhere in Cheyenne at Fort Francis E. Warren. So any good talk has a summary. As early as 1962, the Air Force realized that a new ICBM basing mode, as well as a new ICBM, would be necessary to counter improvements in Soviet ICBM accuracy and warhead yield. We're talking 15 to 25 megatons per warhead, per missile for the SS-9. Experiments in 65 and 66 demonstrated that the new missile could be cold launched, obviating the need for a hardened launch facility. Now the missile could be transported and launched using a canister system. Nearly 2 decades and 30 basing mode concepts later, the canister launch system ended up in Minuteman Roman numeral 3 launch facilities. It simplified the shock isolation system when compared to Minuteman 3. It also facilitated the increase in missile diameter from 66 inches to 93.4, with a subsequent increase to 10 reentry vehicles. So that in a nutshell is the evolution of the Peacekeeper canister system. How am I doing on time? Oh, not too bad.
No, no, we have plenty of time.
So if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
I have a ton of questions.
Well, fire away.
Um, so my first question is, I'm intrigued by that like cap that was on the Peacekeeper with the dirt. And I'm wondering, was that just done to mask the location of the silo that they covered it with dirt? Like, I don't understand why they did that. They didn't do
Oh,
that.
no, no, that wasn't Peacekeeper. Peacekeeper was just like Minuteman in the launch. What I was showing there was the idea they were going to bury the silos and 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 they would either bury the silos or because the SS-9 was going to be dropping so close and putting ejecta trying to bury the silos, they needed to be able to push through the debris from the blast and launch.
Ah, okay. Gotcha. Okay. And also, the other question I have is Minuteman was not cold launch, was it?
No.
So when they, so if this is where I'm a little bit confused, was Minuteman smaller than Peacekeeper in diameter? And
Oh,
if,
much smaller.
okay, that's what I thought. And because those pictures you're showing me with like the little tiny people, I'm like, wow, this Peacekeeper thing's massive.
10
Um,
foot diameter.
Holy smokes. So then how did they have to convert? these Minuteman silos
I'm
to
sorry,
allow for
I'm sorry, I'm wrong. It was a 9 foot diameter, but go ahead.
when they did the conversion of the Minuteman silos, they also had to allow for adding the gas system for cold launch. I don't know if I missed that
And
maybe in
that
the pre.
came with the canister.
Okay.
Canister, that was all contained in the canister, and all I had to do was put the canister in place, hang it off those 3 pairs of steel cables, and then lower the missile in place, and then Bob's your uncle, they're ready to launch.
Wow. Okay. And then one other kind of just strange question. In the video clip that we showed, when it was initially launching, it looked like the cone had a Westinghouse insignia on it, but I didn't think Westinghouse was involved in de developing the Peacekeeper.
Well, it wasn't. Westinghouse was involved. That was that missile was that. Well, how can I put it? That surrogate was built by Westinghouse, not by Martin Marietta.
Okay.
And that cone had that weird kind of tether coming out of it. That's like I said earlier, they didn't want to spend money on telemetry when it was only going to go 100 feet in the air. So
Yeah.
that was a tether. But yeah, it is funny how Westinghouse made sure their name was prominently displayed.
Right.
The ultimate product placement.
Exactly. Okay. Those were my major questions I had. So, Jim, you
Anyone?
look like you have a question.
I do. Um, was the warhead system installed in the missile and then the entire essentially armed missile dropped into the canister? Or was there a facility where you put the missile in, but you didn't drop it all the way down and somehow you added the warhead on top?
I believe the PISRE, the post boost, well, it's pronounced reentry, the fourth stage. I'm surmising that the first 3 stages were lowered in place. The PISRE was lowered in place, and on top of that came the RVs in at the launch facility. I don't believe they would have transported the RVs on the missile. That would have been, well, they didn't transport an intact missile to the site. They transported the first stage, second stage, and third stage, then the PISRE by itself, the
Okay,
post-boost vehicle, and then the RV got lowered on top of that.
that's what I wondered. Thank you.
You're welcome.
One thing, listening to how much it took later on in the 80s and all to put this together, I keep going back to when the Navy came up with the Polaris missile system, how they cut a fast attack in half, created the way that to integrate so many systems and to put that on a submarine back in the 60s. And it shows you how much genius and technology and quality assurance went into that program when they
Oh,
built it. Do you kind of
absolutely.
agree with that, David?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'll be quite honest. I write about Air Force missiles as well as Navy cruise missiles. But if you ask me what's the best deterrent we have, it's the submarines. Until they make the ocean transparent, which could happen any day now, the submarines remain to me the strongest deterrent. And when you think back about all that happening, I had a chance to interview many of the original officers involved in the Polaris program as part of my Regulus book. And these guys were sharp as tacks. To come up with this steam generated system, gas steam generator. First, they used compressed air. Then the missiles got too heavy. They went to a gas steam generator. And that's what basically the Air Force adopted and enlarged to handle throwing something that weighed 200,000 pounds out of a tube. But the genius to me of the submariners was those initial tubes they put in the first, I don't know, 40 subs were sized to accommodate increased diameter follow-on Polaris missiles. That's brilliant.
I find it interesting today now, some of the old boomers, the Ohio classes, how they put the kind of the canister launcher, multiple Tomahawk missiles now in those tubes that are now basically a tactical carrier, vice a ballistic carrier. And I think
Right.
it's a brilliant move to put that there.
Oh, absolutely. What a great use of those boats and of the missile. I just, my hat's off to the Navy. but don't tell any of my Air Force friends.
By the way, David, I've been to the silo down in Tucson, and I plan on going back again. It's been over 10 years, and I'm due for a new visit. It's
Well, it's
great.
interesting, Mike. They've changed everything around completely. They're,
Ah,
the visitors are there are no more volunteer guides. The
ah,
top half is personal, and you go down and get a tour downstairs. They won't let us do the top to bottom tours, which for increased fee, we would take you down to the engine level, level 7, and work
yeah.
our way back up. It's still under Peam Air and Space Museum um, guidance, but they, I was involved from the very beginning in trying to make the museum into a standalone museum. It never, ever failed to make more money than it cost to run it. And the administration of the museum was so worried that they were going to waste so much money on this black hole, and no one was ever going to go visit the Titan II because it was a missile and not an airframe. And it's one of the most popular parts of the Peam Air and Space Museum.
Well,
But go and see
that's
it
good to
again.
hear.
Go ahead and see it again. I think it's worth the tour. It's just,
And you could do bottom to top again, you said?
no, you can't do that anymore.
Ah,
If I went down there and said I wanted to take someone on a tour, they wouldn't let me. I can go down still with a good friend who was retired as the historian, paid historian. I wasn't paid, as is the story of my life, but um, we can go down and what we call play in the silo, but we can't take someone down with us unless there's a really good reason, like they're nutcases like us about missiles. But Joe Blow tourist doesn't get to go down anymore, which I think is terribly myopic of but it was an insurance issue apparently.
uh-huh. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question in the chat. How was the operational capability of the ICBMs assured during the 30 years in place?
I'm not sure. How was it assured?
Yeah, John, I don't know if you can come off of mute to maybe elaborate.
So, how were they ready to go? How were you able to determine whether they were fully functional and capable of firing?
Each one of them, the Titan II had its own safety, what do they call it? I'm starting spacing on it. Missile. Oh, I can't remember the acronym. But both Minuteman and Titan II were constantly monitored for readiness. So yes, they were, unless there was major maintenance going on, 90+% of them of the missiles were ready to be launched.
90%.
Well, that's just a number I'm pulling out of thin air. It might have been 80%, but 80% of 1,000 missiles is still a lot of missiles.
I guess as a follow-up question, was there any type of interaction that the assembly or interaction that the personnel that were staffing the silos required to do prior to a launch? Assembly or
Minuteman, they basically turn keys. Titan II, all 4 crew members were involved in checking the launch facility and the equipment and the missile. That was constantly being monitored.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
What if I recall, Peacekeeper was not really operational for a long time. It was like what, about 10 years, I think.
Yeah, something like that.
And what replaced it?
Nothing. The Minuteman III was retained with 3 RVs. It was a bargaining chip. I was told by a good friend who knows these kind of things, they cut a lot of corners to get the Peacekeeper in place in time and under time constraint. And so Peacekeeper is going to be very expensive to maintain and take care of the construction mistakes. So getting rid of it and trading it in the strategic arms limitation talks was the right thing to do. But Sentinel, if they can keep the cost down, which is not happening, is going to replace, was supposed to replace Minuteman 3. It's taking longer. For instance, they'd save money by using the same launch facilities. Well, a lot of the launch facilities in Minot have water intrusion problems, so they have to be replaced. They'll use the ones they can, but for the most part, they're going to have to dig new holes. And back in the 60s, early 60s, when they did this, there was no EPA. There was nobody to say, you can't do that. You're disturbing the soil, the environment. Now, to dig a new hole, they're going to have to make sure I think, they're going to have to make sure they're on the Air Force ground that's owned by the Air Force, not outside of it. And that's just supposition on my part.
Any other questions? I'm going to take silence as a no, but that was great. Another great talk, David. Really thank you for all the detail. It's
Well,
always
thank
fascinating
you.
to learn about these missiles.
Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to if we can arrange to do one on sounding rockets and reentry vehicle testing. That's a whole nother story that's not been told.
Well, you have an open invitation, so depending on,
Okay,
we can talk offline about timing of that either next year or we can add another lecture. This year, I'm pretty flexible, and I know my audience would always appreciate having you back to talk again. So,
okay,
uh,
we'll do that. Thank
all
you,
right,
everybody. I
yeah,
appreciate the questions and thank you, Jim. I look forward to listening to your talk again.
all right. Well, thank you,
Okay,
and we'll see everybody online again in July. That will be with our speaker from the UK talking about the second cosmonaut in space, Gurman Titov. So looking forward to that as well. And we will see you next month. Take care,
Well done.
everyone.
So long.